Joining us for today's webinar, Understanding Implicit Bias. Our presenter today is Janine Jenkins, who is a facilitator with CPS HR Consulting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few pieces of information with you about the webinar. To avoid interruptions to the presentation, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You can still ask questions using the Q&A panel in your webinar dashboard, though. We'll make every effort to address your questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website and also as a handout in your webinar dashboard. We will forward a link to all of today's attendees once the recording is available for viewing. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Janine.
Good morning. Good morning. It is really good to be here. And as folks have been chatting in, we see that we have people from all across the country in various roles within human resources. And that's really very cool. I'm glad to have a very diverse group of roles and responsibilities in the audience, and so I think that's going to make for great conversation. So I would like for you to take a second to think about, I was in this situation where I was helping as a part of the interview team, and we were interviewing a gentleman that had been, whose past experiences led to him being a drill sergeant in the military over the course of his career. And as part of his interview process, he had come in, he had had his face-to-face interview, and when he came in, here's what we saw. We saw a man, probably about 6 feet tall, physically fit, thin. He was relatively thin. He had very good posture, and he had a haircut that was what I have been known to be referred to as high and tight. And when he sat down in his chair, he had great posture. He sat up very straight. He folded his hands in front of him. And when we asked him questions, he answered very succinctly. There wasn't any additional conversation, but the answers were fine. There was nothing wrong with his answers. There was nothing wrong with his appearance. And after that interview, in our discussion, we were talking about who he was and how he might fit into the team, and someone said, well, he's been a drill sergeant before, and I think, bringing that to the team, it could destroy morale. In our conversation, this gentleman said nothing about being a drill sergeant. This gentleman did not demonstrate any of I think what we typically see as far as a drill sergeant is concerned on television. He wasn't, shouting with the veins popping out of his neck or anything weird that way. But because of how he showed up and what we saw on his resume, we drew a conclusion that essentially biased our opinion about who he was and how he would be able to fit into the team. In the end, we brought the gentleman in, we asked him about his experience as a drill sergeant, and in asking him about this experience, he laughed. He threw his head back, he laughed, he certainly relaxed more than we had seen previously, and he said, there's no way that I could exhibit the amount of energy today that I needed to exhibit when I was a drill sergeant. And in the end, we ended up hiring the gentleman, and he is magnificent. He has connected with the team. He certainly is a great team leader. His team has great morale, and they are very high performing. That is an example of a bias. That is an example of having an attitude or sort of falling into this stereotype and allowing it to drive our decisions. My name is Janine Jenkins, and I am going to be your facilitator today. And the purpose of my being here today is to help you begin the learning that's going to create real change. Unconscious bias is a social justice issue that gives birth to all kinds of isms, racism, sexism, all those kinds of things in our society. And without understanding where they come from, we'll never be able to do anything about it. And so that's my purpose with you here today. I hope to answer a number of questions that you may already have. Certainly, as we go through the process, as questions pop up, feel free to jot those in our Q&A section. And there may be a few that I don't address with this content, but certainly we can talk through that through our engagement today, and to maybe determine if there's a way for me to follow up with you for an answer. And with that, let's get started. We go out into the world every day and make decisions about what is safe or not, what is appropriate or not, and so on. The automatic decision-making is what psychologist Joseph Ledoux has suggested is an unconscious danger detector that determines whether or not something or someone is safe before we can even begin to unconsciously make a determination. So when the object, animal, or person is assessed to be dangerous, a fight or flight fear response occurs. So our learning objectives for today are, we're going to define unconscious or implicit bias. We're going to identify some biases in the workplace. We will discuss some of the impacts of unconscious bias. And while they do have an impact, sometimes it can be difficult to identify. And so we'll talk through that a little bit. And then we'll take a look at some strategies to recognize biases, maybe help you minimize biases, or just eliminate them altogether. During today's webinar, I would encourage you to actively participate. I do have some things built into our time today, which will hopefully encourage you to sort of use your chat to let us know what's going on and what you're thinking about. I would encourage you to try not to multitask while we're together today. So close all other applications, including your email. I hope to make this worth the time that you are going to spend away from your email today. And I want you to be ready to be engaged in today's topic. Just as a note, to protect confidentiality, all questions asked via our time today together will come to me directly, so you don't have to worry about asking a question and worry and sort of be concerned as to whether or not it's going to be seen by the wider group. It is not. It is coming directly to myself and my producer, Julie. So here is going to be our first opportunity to engage. And so with that, in a word or phrase, what comes to mind when you think of the term implicit bias?
Go ahead and enter in your responses in the Q&A panel. And I'm seeing unfair, lawsuit, prejudice, discrimination. That one was in all caps. Stereotypes, and getting quite a few of the same. So we've got one-sidedness, rude subjectivity, bias that is internal and maybe unrealized, racism, discrimination and stereotype, unfair, first impression, socioeconomics, predetermined opinions, self-stated, and favoring one over the other, microaggression, and micro inequities, comfort. Okay.
Very cool, very cool. So yeah, so bias encompasses all of that. Bias can be based on a bunch of different things. To name a few, skin color, gender, age, height, weight, introversion versus extroversion, marital and parental status, disability status, foreign accent, where someone went to college, and a whole lot more. So I think you are dead on when you think about those things that are connected to bias. So let's break bias down a little bit more. So here is a definition for bias. So this comes to us from the Kirwan Institute on Race, or this is our definition of bias, just bias specifically. So cognitive bias is a mistake in reasoning, and so this is what we're sort of focusing on. So that's disproportionate weight in favor against one thing, right? That's what we're talking about when it comes to bias. And so we all have bias. We all make choices that discriminate in favor of the comfortable without realizing the tendency and potentially in opposition to our conscious belief system. So we make unconscious bias choices that maintain safeness and stability, and they're safe, likable, agreeable, and valued. I mean, it's just sort of the natural order of things. So when we talk about bias, let's kind of break that down a little bit further. So first, there is explicit bias. So attitudes and beliefs we have about a person, group on a conscious level. So people are more likely to express explicit biases when they perceive an individual or group to be a threat to their well-being. So research has shown that when it comes to race, that we do perceive different things based on what somebody looks like. And I think most recently we can take a look at race and sort of figure out some of the biases that people may have around the perception of national security, being at risk, or expressing other negative attitudes towards other groups. When people perceive their biases to be valid, they're more likely to justify unfair treatment or even violence. And unfair treatment can have long-term negative impacts on physical and mental health. So that's sort of when we're talking about explicit bias. And so that is when it is known. It is something that is communicated and it's said sort of out loud. The converse to that is implicit bias. And so this is a definition that I have taken from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at the Ohio State University. And so the difference between implicit and explicit bias is simply the level of awareness, right? So explicit bias is expressed and publicly stated. Implicit bias operates without conscious control. That is implicit bias. We don't necessarily have conscious control over it. And this is something that we all have. When we are talking about implicit bias, it is as a result of mental associations that have been formed by direct and indirect messages that we receive. It could be about different groups of people. It could be about anything. And we're constantly exposed to certain identity groups being paired with certain characteristics. And because of that, we can begin to automatically and unconsciously associate the identity with characteristics, whether or not that association aligns with reality. And so it's just sort of the nature of how this sort of comes about. And so when it comes to implicit bias, it can be positive or negative. It doesn't necessarily always have to be negative. I think when we discuss implicit bias, it is most often in the negative form, but there are potential ways in which implicit bias can be positive. And so we can get a lot of our association in this respect from the media and the news. I mean, it's just sort of when we think about how some networks, if you will, are skewed versus the kind of information that they share. So that is an example of getting implicit association with potential information that we're getting from the media. So let's dig into the research, because implicit bias is something that has been studied. This is something that comes from the field of social neuroscience. And our research demonstrates that it does come from a specific place in the brain. And we use the same part of our brain to think about others that are similar to us as we do when we think about ourselves. And our brain has to handle a ton of information. So just think about all of the decisions that you have made from the time you got to work to right now. You've made a ton of decisions, and it is all of that decision making that is how and why we kind of get this implicit bias. So here's how it sort of breaks down. So our brain takes shortcuts to help us filter through all of these pieces of information we receive by looking at patterns and filtering to us the most important information. And so the shortcut that our brains create for us is based on the cumulative effect of everything we've been exposed to throughout our lives. So this bias is something that we are essentially hardwired. And so I think for all of us, we can say that we are hardwired to prefer people who look like us, who sound like us, and who share our interests. You know, what comes to mind is when we're in those recruiting spaces or when we're in those interview spaces and we immediately connect with somebody. Think about that for a second. How much of that immediate connection is because they are like someone that you know? They might exhibit characteristics that are similar to yours. And so that is an example of potentially an implicit bias, and that's positive. That can be a positive situation because your brain has sort of picked up on patterns that are similar to things that you like, and because of that, you immediately connect and want to move forward. While these patterns can increase our efficiency, it can increase our efficiency, but it's the categories used in these processes that are sometimes not logical, and in some instances, not even modern. Not to mention that because of these processes that might not be logical or modern, this is what can lead to behaviors or actions that result in not being legal, especially when it comes to decisions that are made in the workplace. So let's take a look at some characteristics of implicit bias. So bias operates at the subconscious level, outside of our conscious awareness. It's pervasive. So everyone has these biases, even people with avowed commitment to be impartial. So when we're thinking about judges and potentially police officers and doctors and teachers, there is bias there. It is just the way, it's the way we work. Implicit and explicit biases are related, but they can potentially be distinct mental constructs. So they're not mutually exclusive, but they may reinforce each other. Implicit associations we hold, they don't necessarily align with what we believe, because remember, they're implicit, they're on a subconscious level, so they may not necessarily align with what we believe or reflect what we explicitly endorse. Biases can run contrary to our conscious stated beliefs, so that's just something to sort of keep in mind. We tend to hold biases that favor our in-group, and because we tend to hold biases that favor our in-group, we can still hold biases against our in-group. So think about that a little bit. We can favor our in-group, but we can have biases against our own in-group. So, you know, even thinking about something as simple as having a college degree versus not having a college degree, right? And so what does that look like, I don't know, inside your own family? Do you have a differing opinion or feeling about someone in your family that maybe didn't go to college, yet you've gone to college and have a degree? So that could be an instance of a bias inside our own in-group. The good news is biases are malleable. So while we do have these shortcuts, while they are hardwired, while they are extremely complex, we can unlearn some of our biases and sort of relearn a new way of thinking. It is going to take some energy on our part, but it is something that is possible. So I want to show you a quick graph. So this is a graph that I came across from an organization called Bristol. And in the graph, the red line represents the biases that people will confidently admit to, right? So that's the red line. Those are biases that people confidently admit to. So, you know, when you look at it, almost no one will admit to having a prejudice against disabled people or women, right? But listen to this. When unconscious biases are measured, that's the blue line, nearly 40% of people have unconscious biases against particular genders and people of color. So the blue line is one when we're not talking about it, right? So think about when I look at this chart, I think about being in a room by myself and, you know, people clicking and no one knows what they're clicking because it's counting the data versus the red line. You're in a group and you're talking and you have to share what that bias might be. The discrepancy between our conscious and unconscious biases, that's the opportunity we have to improve people's decisions and leverage the advantage of talent for the benefit of our organization. It's that space in there that we have to be able to work with to really help move our organizations forward and kind of create these new patterns, these new ways of thinking when it comes to how we feel about our bias. So let's take a look at the pervasiveness of implicit bias. So these are areas in which, you know, bias presents itself and can create a lot of varying issues. So in your chat box, what are other areas that might be impacted by our implicit cognitive biases?
Okay, please use your Q&A panel. I'm seeing someone that has said loans, housing, team morale, communication style, relationships, trust, food choices, testing, social status, humor, valuing another's contributions, where you live, appearance, interview panels, interaction with others, how you take in data, court hearings, respecting others' input. Give it a couple more seconds to get those answers in.
Yeah.
We've got points of view, discipline, clothing or what someone wears, income, reacting to something, and leadership choices, team selection, cultural differences. Okay. Relationships, associations, the car you drive. Dental health, interracial relationships. Okay.
Very cool. Very cool.
Quite a bit of variety.
Yeah, yeah. So just here's some statistics that I thought I'd throw out to you as it relates to implicit bias. So 58% of Fortune 500 CEOs are cisgender men just shy of 6 feet tall, right? But get this, only 14.5% of the male population are the same size. So how is it that over 50% of Fortune 500 CEOs are just shy of 6 feet tall, but yet 14.5% of the male population isn't that tall? A Duke University study found that mature-faced people, so mature-faced, had a career advantage over baby-faced people. And so they defined baby-faced people as people with large, round eyes, high eyebrows, and a small chin, right? So we're talking about the shape of the face, not necessarily age and what that person looks like. We're talking about characteristics of the face. Here's another statistic. Gender representation, or another example of bias. Gender representation in the media has influence, and it is favorable to men. So those are examples of implicit bias, simply because of when you look at, well, where's the representation of other characteristics? And that's what we're talking about. Those are the things that we're focused on. So one of the things that I would like us to do is I'd like us to try an exercise called the circle of trust. And this is, and I'll sort of explain to you why I want to do, what the purpose of this is in just a second. So if you would, I'd like for you to get a blank sheet of paper, and in a column on the left-hand side, I'd like for you to put the initials of 6 to 10 people whom you trust and who you trust the most, and but they are not family members. So blank sheet of paper, initials of 6 to 10 people that you trust who are not family members. So I'll give you a couple seconds to do that.
I have someone asking if you please repeat the directions.
Sure.
Could you say that one more time?
I'd like for you to take a blank sheet of paper and write down in a column on the left-hand side the initials of 6 to 10 people that you trust the most who are not family members. You got your 6? Okay. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to call out a few dimensions of diversity that I want you to then, I guess, place a tick beside those members of that circle who are similar in that dimension to you. So let me repeat that because that felt kind of clumsy. So I'm going to read out some dimensions of diversity. And as I read out these dimensions of diversity, I want you to place a tick mark beside those members of your trusted circle who are similar to you in that dimension. Are you ready? Okay. So looking at your list, I want you to place a tick mark next to everyone in your list that has a similar gender to you. So place a tick mark next to everyone in your list that has a similar gender to you. And so the next one is native language. I want you to place a tick mark next to everyone in your list that has a native language similar to yours.
So that would be in a second column?
Yes, that would be in a second column, yep. Age. Place a tick mark next to everyone in your list that has a similar age to you. And for me, when I was thinking about age, I would say, age plus or minus 5 or 10 years. I think that's the same general age group. Okay. So we said everyone in the list that has a similar gender, everyone in the list that has a similar native language, everyone in the list that has a similar age. And so the next one is race. Looking at your list, place a tick mark next to everyone in your list that has the same race as you. Now remember, race is what we can see, right? So race is skin color, eye color, hair texture, those things that we see. That's what we mean by race. So place a tick mark next to everyone in your list that has the same race as you. And then lastly, place a tick mark next to everyone that has the same educational background as you, the same or similar education background as you. Okay, so one more time, I'll go through those areas, those dimensions of diversity. We put a check mark next to everyone that had the same gender, everyone that had similar gender, everyone that had a similar language, everyone that had that similar in age, everyone that's similar in race, and everyone that is similar in educational background. When you look at this list, how much diversity is there? For me, and I did this exercise right along with you, I will tell you, my list has minimal diversity, I
have a couple of questions about the education.
Okay.
Someone wants to know, for education, do you mean degree or no degree, or would you consider masters and bachelors to be the same or different education?
So for me, that's a great question. So for me, I said bachelor's degree, and so because my education, for me personally, I have a bachelor's degree. And so when I'm looking at folks that are similar in my educational background, they attended secondary or post-secondary, have post-secondary education, and they have a degree higher than high school. So that's what I define as educational background.
A degree or no degree?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So this exercise is our tendency, demonstrates our tendency or our preference for people like ourselves. This is what we call an affinity bias, or in-group, affinity or in-group bias. And it's very well researched. And in general, people extend not only greater trust, but also greater positive regard, cooperation, and empathy to in-group members compared with out-group members. So this preference for people like ourselves, it's instinctive and it's unconscious. So this is an example of bias that we have, even as practitioners of HR, this is potentially an example of bias. And so let's sort of take this a step further. And so if this is affinity bias and it has minimal diversity and all those kinds of things, how does that play out when we're talking about opportunities for individuals in our organizations? If we extend cooperation and positive regard for people who are similar to us, what about people who are dissimilar to us? Will we extend that courtesy? Will we pull them in for mentorship? Will we think of them for high-level assignments? Will we think of them when it comes to these presentations in front of senior-level leadership? Will we be thinking about people who are not like us when it comes to those kinds of assignments if we have an affinity bias? And the research shows that the affinity bias can prevent that kind of thing from happening. It can prevent us from extending those kinds of opportunities for people who are dissimilar to us. And it's not intentional that we're overlooking people who don't look like us. Again, it's just our bias. Another kind of bias to touch on within the workplace is gender bias. So gender bias is unintentional and automatic mental associations based on gender. And gender bias can stem from traditions, norms, values, culture, or potentially experience. And automatic associations feed into decision-making around the assessment of individuals according to gender and gender stereotypes. A great example quickly is that someone gave my son a kitchen, like the little Fisher-Price kitchens where you get to cook, you got dishes and plates and all the fake food. Well, they said, do you mind if I give this to your son? And I had to think for a second. And it kind of caught me off guard, and I really had to figure out why am I hung up on my son having a kitchen? Well, because it is my experience in growing up that my mother did everything in the kitchen. My mom cooked the meals, she washed the dishes, and that's what I grew up seeing. And even now in my own home, I cook all the meals, I do all the dishes. I am responsible, air quotes, for the kitchen. And so I had to realize that I had a bias around gender that was associated with roles of male and female in the home in this particular situation. And so in the end, my son got the kitchen, and he absolutely loves it. And it dawned on me that, he's going to have to cook for himself. Right? At some point, these are skills that he is going to need in order to be a functioning adult, and I would be doing him a disservice if I didn't sort of encourage that behavior, if I didn't help him sort of understand, we all do stuff in the kitchen. So now in my home, I include my husband when we're cooking meals. He's in the kitchen and he's watching, so that my son can now see himself represented in this function, this role in the home. Another example of a bias in the workplace is potentially the halo effect. And so this is the tendency to think everything about a person is good because you like that person. And then we tend to, with the halo effect, we tend not to see red flags because we like this person and we really want them. I would venture to say that in some instance, there could be some affinity bias also playing a role in this as well, because we like them because they are like us. There is perception bias. So the tendency to form a stereotype or assumption about a certain group and make it possible to make an objective judgment about members of those groups, right? So the perception, if you're forming a stereotype about an entire group. And then there's confirmation bias. So the tendency for people to seek information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. For confirmation bias, check out your social media, right? So how many of us have social media platforms where we have people that are expressing different views than what we believe and what we hold ourselves? Typically, we find that people on our social media sites are confirming our own opinions and pre-existing beliefs. And you'll know, here's how you'll know if you got confirmation bias, or here's how you can recognize confirmation bias at work. If you've ever had someone post something on social media, and I'm specifically speaking about Facebook, not the LinkedIn's of the world, and they post something and they'll end it. And if you disagree with me, you can unfriend me now. That is an example of confirmation bias at work, right? So if you don't have the same belief or assumption as me, I don't want to engage. And then lastly is horn effect. And that's when someone creates a poor first impression and that impression sticks. And as recruiters, we are, it has been my experience that recruiters tend to be guilty of horn effect because we are moving so quickly and we need to get so many things done. We use that 3.5 seconds of first impression, and we spend the rest of the time essentially confirming what that first impression was. And so I've actually heard people say that in presentations, that they meet somebody and they get a first impression and they spend the rest of the time essentially confirming that first impression is indeed true. And so, that takes work, especially if as a recruiter, that's how you were taught to recruit and to assess people. These are in no way all of the biases that have been researched. In the course of putting this together, I found that there are potentially 150 different biases that are out there and have been researched. So definitely check it out. So strategies for addressing implicit bias. So learn more about your bias. One way to do that is through the implicit association test. And so that is, it is a test that has been put together by a research team at Harvard, and using how you're able to rapidly match images of individuals of different demographics to pictures or words of varying pleasantness, as it were. So they're using the quick associations that test takers make to reveal unconscious bias. So quickly, here's a list of all of the IATs that you can take if you go to this implicit bias website. And so we've included that link on your handout. These tests track how many mistakes you make and measure how quickly you press the keys, right down to fractions of a second, to be able to measure your bias. So the idea is that the hesitation, where you have to think about it, that is what sort of reveals that bias. So this is the implicit association test put together by Harvard, and it is a way to help you figure out where your bias lies. And as you can see, there are tons of things that you can take, but this is one strategy for doing that. Another strategy is look different. So this is a 7-day bias cleanse, and it sends you emails for 7 days on race, gender, and anti-LGBTQ+ initiatives that will provide you with daily tasks that will help you to begin to change your associations. And so you just put your email address in, and every day it sends you an email of different activities. And so as you can see right here, you can determine what you'd like to receive information regarding as it relates to your bias. And so that's a way that you can, that's a strategy for at least figuring out where does my bias lie, and then what action can I take to prevent that from impacting me. Limit your exposure to stereotypes. So I get it, you know, we get home from a long day and we want to watch TV, but the media, print, and even online, they're slanted to present a certain kind of opinion. And we're taking it in and we're not conscious of it, and the more that we take in, it begins to reinforce that opinion. So part of limiting exposure is avoiding media that reinforces our stereotypes as much as possible. And then the action, seek out counter-stereotypical examples that will help you see stories, movies, books, experiences that can give you a different perspective. Seek counter-stereotypical images. So we talked about that. So just again, own your perceptions and reactions. And then increase your self-awareness, right? So make an effort to assess. Think about members of stereotyped groups as individuals and think about their traits individually. So and color blindness, that's not the answer. Seek specific information about racial and other minority groups that will, again, help you to realize positive examples of a particular group. Make an effort to encounter and engage with people of different groups. And it's not just about race. Engage with folks of different ages, different educational backgrounds, different whatever. Make it a point to engage with folks who are different than you. And then seek feedback, right? So this is where we sort of tap into our emotional intelligence and that self-reflection piece. So take the time to notice when your responses, when your behaviors are caused by your implicit bias, right? So going back to the example of my son and his Fisher-Price kitchen, right? I have to sort of take a step back and sort of dig into what is that reaction about, because that's not right. In order for me to sort of realize that, though, I needed to have that self-reflection. So build self-awareness and then create new associations. So this is how we reprogram the brain. This is where we need to be intentional because new practices come through, new associations come through practice and repetition, right? So recognize your stereotypical thoughts and then label them, right? Yes, this is a stereotypical thought. Now that you've identified it, you can begin the process of challenging that and figuring out how you make it right, how you reprogram it. And then, you know, the engagement survey. When we're in the workplace, we can use the engagement survey. There are questions that we can use on our engagement survey to sort of figure out what is going on in our work areas, what is going on in our organizations, and that, as HR practitioners, can give us the information we need to be able to know where do we start, what do we need to do, how do we help to sort of shepherd people, as it were, into the process of reprogramming and thinking about things differently. At the end of the day, there is no easy answer for how we can begin this process. The best answer I can give you is begin the process. Figure out sort of where you are, how it's affecting you, and then begin doing the research about how do I reprogram, how do I begin to think differently, where do I find the pieces that I have the stereotypical attitudes about, and how do I gain information that helps me to get a broader, more dynamic view so that I can have an opinion that is different and more inclusive. So with that, what can you do to immediately get started? If you would just sort of drop in your chat you know, any answers that you can think about currently about what you can do to immediately get started. And, you know, I will hold you to your own recognizance in terms of that accountability piece, because we've got to start somewhere. We've all got to start somewhere, and this is a good place to start.
Okay. So I'm seeing initiate dialogue with people that are different from you.
Yep.
Visit the websites recommended. Share these concepts with the management team. Love that. Spend more time with more diverse people. Lunch, hanging out, etc. Self-reflection. Self-reflection. Acknowledge that it occurs. Oh yeah, these are great. And be honest with yourself. Make an effort to see the opposite of what your assumptions are. Try to keep an open mind. These are some great answers. Okay, managers and supervisors, more in detail about bias and diversity. Sorry, these answers are scrolling by pretty quickly. Be more conscious of your decisions, be more open-minded, and interact more with people that are different than yourself. Give your opinion and experiences others might not be aware of them. Introduce this to the executive team. So, with this, are we ready to get into questions?
Yeah. What questions do you have?
Okay, I've got some questions that have come in as well. The first one is, can you share some specific strategies to use in recruiting, interviewing, hiring, training, and retention?
Sure. So for recruiting, you know, one of those things could be, you know, have you ever tried to look at resumes without looking at the name? Right? So there is actually a study where candidates with names that are accepted by the dominant culture receive 50% more callbacks than quote unquote African American sounding names. And we could do this study for any name that is different from what the dominant culture recognizes as quote unquote normal. So maybe try recruiting without looking at the name and look at the merits of the resume. You know, that can help to sort of decrease that bias. If you've got some time, which we all have an infinite amount of free time, right? Try it. What about a blind interview? Right? What about interviewing somebody without even seeing who they are and just listening to their voice or listening to how they answer the question? So that's a way that we can, that we might be able to take bias out of the recruiting process.
Okay, so here's a question. We've got an attendee who says, it's odd that in my affinity bias table, I only had 2 people who had 3 tick marks. Does this mean that my circle of trust is generally diverse?
Sure. So yes, it can mean that. And one of the things that I didn't say is just we're talking about affinity bias, and we're talking about, you know, there are tons and tons of biases. We all may have different biases, right? So think about where that comes from, right? So I grew up in the Midwest, and so maybe because I grew up in the Midwest, I might have different biases because my experiences were different, and the information that my brain had in order to determine these shortcuts was different than maybe the information that someone growing up in California received. So we're talking about bias, but we all have different biases, and I don't think it's fair to say that we've all got affinity bias. And I think biases can be different, and I think our biases can be different in different situations.
Okay, thank you. That's a great explanation. Here's another interesting one. Our attendee asks, during recruiting, we often say we are looking for a good fit. Does that idea mean we are automatically applying biases?
it depends. What is a good fit? And so I have had the opportunity to work with teams, and let me preface this by saying I have said, oh, that person's just not a fit. That person. And so what and to some degree, I still do say it today. But here's what I do differently today than what I did before. When I say someone is not a fit, I force myself to define what it is I'm talking about. So I have to be able to say, you know, this person has moved around jobs a lot, or, you know, this person, I don't see leadership. I don't see leadership conversation. Or what is it that I'm not seeing that makes this person not a fit? So I think a good way to sort of avoid that is define fit. What does that mean? And so even in the definition of fit, you do have to be careful that you're not creating something that excludes another group, right? But I think it's important to be able to articulate, what do you mean by fit? And you can't say, well, I just don't think they fit. Well, why? Right? And so be able to talk to that. So I do think to some degree, yes, that statement can perpetuate the concept of bias.
Great, thank you. So here's another question that just came in. Why is colorblindness not a good strategy?
Because it's who we are. I am the total sum of my experiences. And our experiences in some instances are as a result of our race. And so I think to be colorblind, to say that, oh, I don't see race, I think you don't see who people are, because I think there are things that are inherent to folks' lives, especially when we're talking about minorities, that is directly related to what you see when they show up physically. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because, you know, none of us can turn our race on and off. And so I think it's one characteristic, and it does deserve appropriate weight. Not to say that it deserves, you know, a ton of weight to influence all of the decisions.
Okay, terrific. This is a really interesting one. During an interview as an applicant, the interview asked if I had any biases. Is this an appropriate question to ask?
Oh, that is a good question.
Isn't it?
I don't know, like my initial thought is I don't see why not. I don't see why it isn't an appropriate question. I would be curious as to what makes them want to answer that question. I'd further be curious about, you know, the connection between that question and the position that you're interviewing for, right? Because we know that when we interview, our questions need to be directly related to the ability to perform the position. And so how does that play into the position that you're talking about? You know, and is there a way to sort of ask that question and then formulate your answer based off of that? Because I think the answer is yes, you've got biases. The question then becomes, you know, in the interview, what do you want to reveal and what do you not want to reveal?
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. And let's use, and sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions, we will reach out to you after the webinar. So this last question, you mentioned the engagement survey with a question, I feel comfortable expressing my true opinions in the workplace. What other questions would help us gauge the perceived level of engagement? Excuse me. So sure, I mean, if you're using the Likert scale, ask. You know, a phrasing could be, I believe bias plays a role in our workplace. You know, strongly agree, you know, disagree, that kind of thing. And you're just sort of getting engaged. When you think of bias, what do you think of? What sort of bias reduction programs would you look forward to participating in, right? So that's more around, you know, we are making the notation that that bias exists.
how is the best way for us to address it in a way that you can connect to most, right? So I think there are lots of ways in which you can ask these questions that would elicit good information for moving forward.
Okay, terrific. Well, we are at time now. I want to thank you, Janine, for a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Again, we will send an email with a link to today's recording and the slide deck. Thank you. Hope you all have a good day.